Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and it feels like patch 8.3 has officially kicked off. The Mythic Raid is out and about. You are now able to get far better rewards from Mythic Pluses, and even PvP, you can finally get some really insanely good rewards. So this seems like a really good time to cover some of the corruptions, since they are going to be one of the biggest things that we'll be utilizing in order to do more damage in this new patch. Corruptions are very important to each class, and each class is going to value them differently. In this video, I want to cover rogues. I'm going to be covering Assassination, Subtlety, and Outlaw for all the best corruptions that are available. As you're collecting all the variety of different gear and variety of different corruptions, you'll be able to figure out which ones you want to keep and which ones you might want to permanently cleanse. First of all, let's talk about cleansing and why it might be good for you to cleanse your gear. Cleansing means you are removing the corruption effect completely, which isn't completely a bad thing. Sometimes you get some loot with an insanely bad corruption, but the stats on that thing are so good, and sometimes it's worth removing the corruption so you don't have to deal with nearly as many negative effects while still trying to get the most value out of the gear. It also should be added that corruptions by themselves are not an instant gimme. That means just because you have a specific corruption doesn't mean your character is now all of a sudden busted and overpowered. Those negative effects can affect you quite greatly. Like in PvP, it might keep you constantly slowed when you're trying to chase after a healer, or in dungeons and raids, you might be taking unnecessarily large amounts of damage when the negative effects of corruptions can affect you quite greatly. For example, inside of arenas, if you are chasing after the enemy healer and they're almost done for, and the corruption just starts randomly slowing you. Like nobody is sitting on you, but the corruption itself, because you're doing so good, starts to punish you with that slow, and the healer gets away. Or if you're inside of a raid or a dungeon, your group has taken massive amounts of damage as you guys are about to finish off a boss, and bam, you get slammed down by your own corruption, which in some cases could not only hurt your DPS, but also your group. So some people choose to actually go for lower numbers of corruptions, keeping only the ones that are the most important for very challenging, difficult content. Or sometimes you might want to raise it up for slightly easier content where your spec might be a lot stronger at. This is why this video tries to help you guys guide what rogues might want to look for in corruptions, which ones are definitely worth considering and which ones you might want to completely ignore. I would say the corruption system is far more complicated than the original Warforging or Titanforge system of previous patches, so your usefulness to it might be very subjective. Let's first talk about the strongest corruption that all three specs of Rogue will be able to use in any content: single target, AoE, PvP, or PvE. That is Gushing Wound. Gushing Wound is a corruption that's one of a kind. There's only one specific tier of Gushing Wound, but because of how low corruption it offers and the damage that it applies to, makes this specific corruption on gear probably the biggest value possible. All three specs of rogues are going to want as many Gushing Wounds if you ever get it on your gear, and be sure to never cleanse Gushing Wound, even if it's on a terrible piece of gear. When it comes to Assassination, your best corruption is going to be, outside of Gushing Wound of course, Infinite Stars. And outside of Infinite Stars, you're gonna love anything that gives you secondary bonuses within PvE content. Assassination can utilize Versatility, Mastery, Critical Strike, and Haste in almost equal values. So for Assassination, you're actually very lucky if you got straight up bonus secondary stats procs. For Assassination, you will want to go for something that deals a little bit extra AoE, so something like Echoing Void or Twilight Devastation could also be good, but Gushing Wound, the one we talked about previously, is also insanely good when it comes to AoE, since I guess it can proc off of multiple enemies, and with that, it's a lot easier to proc it. If you're someone who's going to do any PvP as Assassination, I would recommend either anything that increases your Mastery or Versatility for survivability or damage, or any of the corruptions that spawn maybe a tentacle or do any side damage. I would say that Infinite Stars is insanely good if it hits the right target. I've played against Assassination rogues in arenas already, and sometimes their Infinite Stars will just start hitting the healer if they are going about spreading dots, which they should be in order to get more energy. But sometimes it means they are starting to cleave enemy targets, and when you're trying to focus one enemy down, having to cleave two targets, even though that's not what you mean to do, just doesn't feel that great in overall. But I would say Assassination is one of those specs that isn't particularly tied to a majority of the corruptions. It does good damage on its own. Within PvE or PvP, I would say Assassination is probably the easiest one to handle and probably the most forgiving. I would go and sim any kind of corruption that you get on your Assassination to make sure you're not losing out on any value, or to make sure that you are not missing any value on any of the corruption bonuses. Even if you think, like, let's say, something that gives you a little bit of haste from time to time might be benign, it could be huge in terms of the impact that it does for Assassination. But because Assassination doesn't really rely on any of the corruptions, I would also say it's probably the safest choice when it comes to PvP if you don't have a lot of corruption effects. Let's move on to Outlaw, the master of Mythic Plus and the master of Cleave. Just like Assassination, Gushing Wound is going to be the go-to. Outside of that, it's going to want to use any corruption that deals any type of proc damage. So Echoing Void is insanely good, but it recently did get nerfed, so most likely not as good, unless you're going for full AoE. Infinite Stars is also really good for straight up single target damage. Twisted Appendage is also good. The secondary stats are not nearly as good for Outlaw. It doesn't really utilize him nearly as much as Assassination, and it generally tends to lean towards one specific stat in PvE, or with its raid or Mythic Plus, or even in PvP. However, there is one corruption that is exclusive to Outlaw, and that's called Lash of the Void, which can be earned by defeating Raden in Neolotha. And this is exclusive to Outlaw because it's exclusive to everybody who has a fist weapon or who can use a fist weapon. With a limited amount of classes that can have access to those types of weapons, Outlaw is one of those that actually can utilize Lashing Void, as it is incredible in AoE, Cleave, or single target. It's kind of like an all-in-one corruption, and I've been using it a little bit in PvP, and I gotta tell you, the procs for it are pretty great, the damage output is pretty consistent, and overall it synergizes with the playstyle of Outlaw. It almost makes me want to get a second one of those fist weapons just so I can slap those meaty purple tentacles at enemies, but I guess we'll see if my luck is with me next time I go into the raid. There's not a lot of you, but some of you guys do choose to play Subtlety, so I want to make sure I cover Subtlety as the bastard child of rogues that doesn't really get a lot of playtime. As Subtlety, Gushing Wound is still going to be your go-to, just like every other spec, but I would say you're kind of in the middle of Assassination and Outlaw in terms of what you prefer. You don't really like every secondary stat, you're more picky on specific secondary stats. Things like Haste, Critical Strike, Mastery, and Versatility are all good in their own ways, so you really do need to sim for your sub-rogue depending on the gear that you have. However, Subtlety Rogue does like proc-based effects as well, but again, it's very picky. Some like Infinite Stars and Echo and Void are simming a lot higher than some of the other ones that you might be able to get. In AoE for Subtlety, you need any bit of help you can get. So Twilight Devastation, I feel like synergizes really well with the burst-based playstyle. Imagine if you have all your cooldowns popping off, Shadow Blades rolling, you have your Shadow Dance up and running, all that extra damage with symbols of death, and you got massive Twilight Devastation beam coming down at your enemies in the Mythic Plus dungeon, or maybe something like Echoing Void that adds extra sustained value to the playstyle that you might offer. I would say that this system is quite a detailed system in terms of some of the more detailed systems we've ever had when it comes to World of Warcraft and BFA. This is a much more complicated system than Warforging or Titan Forging. It actually has you selecting specific bonuses with also negative effects if you have way too many of those bonuses and trying to judge them. In things like arenas, do you want to be slowed down? In Mythic Plus dungeons, do you want to sometimes take random damage out of nowhere? Do you want to have any of those negative effects affecting your playstyle if things like get really heavy inside of any piece of content? So that's what I like about corruptions, is how you can actually look at the gear you have, look at the different debuffs it offers, and figure out for yourself if this is worth your time or if it's not worth your time. So you can sim all these corruptions, and I feel like when it comes to secondary stats in particular, it might be worth simming. And what's also nice sometimes is, let's say you get a piece of gear with the worst stats possible, but it has a really good corruption, or potentially a good corruption, that could still be an upgrade. So even on my Outlaw Rogue, where I'm gonna get a Haste Mastery piece of gear, but it has a really good corruption, now I have a little bit more thought process of, do I want to keep it, do I want to scrap it, do I want to cleanse it? Cleansing is something that should be talked about, as once you cleanse gear over a corruption, the corruption is gone, it's vanished. You still get to keep the loot, but the corruption effect is permanently gone. So that's why it's a little bit difficult to figure out sometimes if it's worth cleansing gear or not, but in some cases it can be more beneficial. So knowing which corruption effects are beneficial to your spec, which ones are worth keeping, and which ones are not, will help you make more informed decisions, whether you want to keep or whether you want to cleanse. I think the safest choice is any corruption you get on almost any piece of gear, keep it. Put it away in your bank, put it somewhere in the back of your bags, keep it in case you might need it for a rainy day. You never know if you might be able to put together some crazy cool builds like a pure AoE build for dungeons, or a pure massive single target build when it comes to raid bosses. And as we upgrade our cloaks, we'll be able to wear more corruptions on our gear and mix and match a lot more bonuses. So I think that could be quite exciting. But hopefully you guys found this video useful and helpful when it comes to trying to figure out what are rogues looking for corruptions. Also, there's a good chance that this video might be out of date, maybe a week or two after all this information comes out, so it's a good idea to always sim yourself. It's a good idea to subscribe to a couple different websites that have simulations for different corruptions, maybe get raid bots and start simming your character through raid bots as well. There's a lot of useful, helpful tools, and I think I might make a page on Discord showing all the different links that I use for PvP or PvE content, all the different tools that I use in order to be a more successful player at a specific class or a spec. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.